This week's episode is an interview with Ken Hite and Gareth Ryder-Hanrahan about Trail of Cthulhu Second Edition, which will be on Backerkit on or around October 15th. Ken and Gar are writers that Bryce and I both very much respect, and we want to share their project for a game that we've both very much enjoyed, which I think can help inform how to run mysteries, as well as make the 1930s a much more interesting setting if that's a place you want to explore in your mage game. Both Gar and Ken are skilled raconteurs and highly experienced game designers, and I hope that makes up for this being a relatively light episode on Mage the Ascension specific stuff. Bryce and I record a little bit of an outro talking about how we would use some of this in our games. Gar's sound is also terrible. I tried what I could, and it's the best that I could manage. If you're listening to this after October 15th, the project is on Backerkit, link is in the show notes, or search Trail of Cthulhu Second Edition, Backerkit, or something similar. If you sign up to be notified when the Backerkit starts, you will get a free copy of the Quickstart, which outlines a remarkable amount about the game. One thing that we didn't talk about is, since a second edition is coming out and it is completely backwards compatible with the first edition, if you're interested in the game, but whatever the ultimate price, probably $45 to $65, is a little bit too much for you, copies of first edition are probably going to get real cheap, and it's more or less the same game, just with fewer clarifications and maybe not as expanded. So that is also an option. With that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. Zero's Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. Joining me this evening is our senior Mythos correspondent, Bryce Perry. Bryce, what are we talking about tonight, and who do we have the pleasure of joining us?
Well, Terry, tonight we're talking about Trail of Cthulhu Second Edition, published by Pelgrane Press. We've previously talked on the podcast about Dreamhounds of Paris, Fearful Symmetries, Bubble Gumshoe, and Trail of Cthulhu First Edition. And we keep threatening to do one on Esoterrorists and Bookhounds of London. Links in the show notes. But tonight we're joined by authors Kenneth Hite and Gareth Ryder-Hanrahan. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
No, pleasure to be here.
Let's get right into it. We're here to talk about Trail of Cthulhu Second Edition, which uses the lovely Gumshoe system. What kind of character does one play in Trail of Cthulhu, Gar?
One plays an investigator, someone who is delving into the mysteries of the Cthulhu mythos. There are 20 occupations in the book, and there's rules for creating your own ones, which occupation just gives you your basic investigative abilities, and you then customize an investigator from there. But you are someone who is, for one reason or another, driven to investigate mysteries, battle the minions of the mythos, and not so much save the world, give us Lovecraft, but temporarily delay the destruction of the world.
Right. Yeah.
And since you indicated occupation, as opposed to you start by choosing what sorcerer type you are, or alternatively what elder god you serve, it seems like you're just kind of what I'll technically refer to as some guy in the game.
Your parallel is very much some guy. You can be a pulpy some guy where you are some guy, or you can play a purist some guy where you are like, a Lovecraftian protagonist, some guy. So generally like, a New England professor or an aesthetic diary keeping book person. As I shall point out several times, it is 2 a.m. here, so if I lose coherence, I shall hand things over to Ken. So Ken.
Right. Yeah, we've got, as Gar says, about 20 occupations in the core book. The key is that every character has something that we call a drive, which is the reason, the sort of emotional core of your character. What is that? Because everyone's been in a game where some player says, this house is clearly haunted. Why would we be here? Let's leave. It's scary. I don't like it. And that's reasonable. You've put some work into making it a scary house. Every character in Trail of Cthulhu has the drive that tells you, no, this is why I'm in a haunted house instead of in bed or in a nightclub or anywhere else that I could be. And that drive gives you a sort of a touchstone for role-playing, and it reminds you, you're playing the main character in the story, not the guy who saw something spooky and ran away. That guy is a witness. He's an NPC. He's a GMC. He's in another game. Don't worry about him. You're playing, the professor or the FBI guy or the dilettante or the hobo or whatever, who has got some reason that you keep being drawn to the unnatural and the strange. And that reason might be something you don't even know about, right? You could play a character who's got some sort of blood tie to the mythos and doesn't know it. Maybe they're a deep one, a hybrid or a ghoul changeling or something like that. They don't know it. Maybe they've got a curse, or they're just incredibly stupidly unlucky or drawn to this, but maybe they've got some psychological compulsion. They're either driven by the ennui of regular life, or they're too arrogant to know that this is obviously dangerous and stupid, that they're like, I can take it. I'm a PhD in parapsychology, damn you. Then, of course, we all learned what that got you in 1930s as much as it does today.
One of the most contradictory phrases we get in English literature, firm New England stock.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
So, game includes modes of play. What are modes of play, and why do you feel that they're important to the game?
The modes are, as Gar intimated, pulp, which is playing in the sort of spirit of Robert E. Howard, where when the mythos shows up, you might shoot it or punch it, and that would be a reasonable, maybe reasonable is a strong word, but a normal response to it. And sort of your Indiana Jones, strange adventures with supernatural happenings type vibe, as opposed to the purist mode, which is in the school of sort of the later Lovecraft, where you are less a adventurer and more an experiencer, where you encounter the mythos and are generally broken or at least very badly changed by it. And that experience is, of course, the core to sort of the later Lovecraft, as well as maybe you could argue the philosophical core of the whole thing. But Lovecraft wrote in both modes. He has adventurer characters that do a rooftop chase against the deep ones. He has characters that fight back against the Dunwich Horror and disintegrate with magic. He's got good old Dr. Willett, who melts Joseph Kerwin. So Lovecraft writes in both modes. Purist is just a part of Lovecraft, and pulp is to accentuate the sort of fighty part of Lovecraft and then add Two Gun Bob on top of it. And I stole that idea from Paranoia XP by Alan Varney, because when he was redesigning Paranoia, he realized that no two game groups played Paranoia in the same way. And he said, well, it's still the same game. I'll just give them rules for each of the types of Paranoia play that there are. That you might play Paranoia as a comedy, you might play it as a dystopia, you might play it as an adventure, and he has the special modes for that. And I said, that is such a good idea. I should steal it. And that's what I did. And so, I mean, when we all got Call of Cthulhu, or at least when I all got Call of Cthulhu back in the 80s, we were playing, Tommy guns against deep ones all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's only later that both us and I think to a larger extent Chaosium said, oh, okay, easy steady there, big fella. Let's engage with the philosophical core of Lovecraft's project, and created things like Return to Dunwich that are very, purist scenarios. And I wanted to be able to do that out of the gate with Trail. The people who want to just go in two guns blasting against a mummy would have a great time, and characters that wanted to sort of stare at a strange aurora in the sky until their eyes melted would also have a good time.
And what's more maids than that? I would like to note that to prove that you're a indie publisher, there isn't a budget for massive frontispieces, but there is amazing graphic design, and both the purists and the pulp have wonderful little glyphs. Yeah. That if there's ever a Pelgrane con, I want to be able to get that as a con badge.
I think there was an online Pelicon during Gen Con last year, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But then you just have an online badge and you could do that with Photoshop. So I'm not sure.
And that was also weird because seemingly everyone from Pelgrane was also at Gen Con as I said hello to all of you and asked dumb questions while sweating.
It was all organized by fans, so that was lovely.
Nice.
Yeah, it's very nice.
Kind of another technology is the idea of a campaign frame, but kind of an idea of a technology to say, hey, it's the 30s. Maybe you don't know where to set this. Maybe you don't know what the inciting incident should be or what some of the characters are. What are those? And kind of what contrivance do you feel it serves for kind of a modern gaming group?
Basic campaign frame is the sort of basic starting points for a campaign. We've given you a sort of series pitch of here's what your investigators are going to be. Here are some sample NPCs that will probably be required in the campaign. Here are the sort of adventures you're going to do. So in the first edition, the three we presented were the Armitage Inquiry, where you're all playing professors at Clark University. You're all associates of Henry Armitage. He goes, oh, there's weird. I got this letter from this farmer up in the hills of Vermont who's complaining about strange buzzing voices in the woods. You're a bunch of parapsychologists and apparently also a linguist and an engineer in lots of explosives. You go off and investigate that. We did Bookhands, which was you're all playing slightly skeevy booksellers in London, and Project Covenant, which is a sort of Delta Green-esque. You are working for the Office of Intelligence, yes.
Yeah.
You stopped Innsmouth and now you're looking into other weird stuff. And in second edition, we're keeping the Armored Inquiry because it's sort of the most default Lovecraftian one. And we have 2 new frames. So Ken, do you want to do your Chicago spiel?
We'd already done, as Gareth says, a whole book on Bookhound, so there's no point reprinting that campaign frame. And we've done Fall of Delta Green since then, which was Project Covenant was our Delta Green. And so we've just done Delta Green, so we thought maybe we won't go back to that well again. So we had room for 2 more campaign frames. And speaking of stealing, I stole the campaign frame idea from Delta Green because Tynes, John Scott Tynes, when he came up with Delta Green, he came up with it as a reason that all your characters are together hunting monsters. So it's not just your internal motivation, it's why the 5 of you? What's that about? And once you answer that, not only do you stop asking, but also that sets up different kinds of play depending on what your answer is. And so that, again, a great idea. So I stole it. And in the second edition, I basically pulled rank. And for our Pulpish campaign frame, I put in a campaign frame that I've literally tried to sell since 2006 to various companies called Shadows Under Chicago, in which Al Capone has gotten his hands on the contents of Joseph Kerwin's basement. And if you remember in Case of Charles Dexter Ward, there's a line about the bootleggers that hold up one of Kerwin's trucks and they find out about stuff. And when Willett goes back to the house, the secret door has been cemented over, which always struck me as weird that the 8th century Anglo-Saxon wizard, got out his trowel and was finishing. No, we wouldn't have done that. But bootleggers, of course, would cement up basements all the time. That was literally, half the gig. So what happened to the stuff in the basement? It obviously got put on trucks and driven away. If it goes to Al Capone, he's literally already around the bend with syphilis, and he's greedy for power and everything else. And so what better kind of a person to unleash Yog-Sothoth in Chicago in 1928 and 29? And so that sets up. Capone has got a, occult wing of the outfit now, and you poor bastards are maybe your rival gangsters, maybe you're, the G-men or the Internal Revenue guys going after Capone, or maybe you're just a group of Chicago investigators who suddenly notice that all hell is let out for breakfast and everything has gotten crazy. And that lets us do gangsters and Tommy guns and Packard coupes driving down Lakeshore Drive and everything. I live in Chicago. I'm a Chicago homer of longstanding. And so it's just baffled me that no one has ever done a Cthulhu Chicago book, except for the tiny little King of Chicago adventure, which barely touches on it. And, it's a natural. It's obvious. And way back in the day when I was running Call of Cthulhu, when I first bought it, I had Gangbusters, the old TSR game of gangsters, and I would play Call of Cthulhu using the maps and everything from Gangbusters as my templates. And again, why this has been laying fallow, it's obviously just been waiting for me. I mean, we finally got it to a point where it's in the book. And then Gar was in charge of the purist campaign frame and knocked it out of the park with something that Gar will tell you about now.
For the purest one, I didn't want to sort of go back to the Lovecraftian well of the monsters and so forth. But Lovecraft's sort of great, what was fantastic ideas was realized that modern science had revealed the godless horror of infinity. So it's leaned much more into his sort of science horror stories, like Color of Space and so forth. So in Under Unknown Skies, you're playing the ordinary people of small town called Bishop in Oklahoma. You were honest, upstanding citizens, you're farmers and newspapermen or town detective or town doctor or whatever. And this mysterious corporation from back east has just opened up a laboratory in the hills around the town. They're doing weird experiments. Those weird experiments are having strange effects on town. They're waking forces up. They're calling things down from the skies. The sort of elevator pitch for that campaign is There Will Be Blood meets Tales of the Loop or Stranger Things. So basically 1930s science horror in small town. And as part of character creation for that one, you don't only build your investigators, you also give the GM a list of your neighbors and one weird thing about each of them. So the GM has a whole slew of both GM seats to play and also plot hooks that you guys have created. And you run from there. and there are things lurking in the earth.
I look forward to playing the Lost Tim Powers book that we never got for Chicago that I know of. But Gar,
Right.
it's hard to make out what you're saying through your thick Oklahoma accent.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I asked Ken to go in afterwards and add local detail.
what to you, Gar, then, as someone who's not from the area, strikes you as interesting when you think about the American 1930s? Like, what to you establishes it as a sense of place?
I think for me, it was just the newness of it. I'm from Ireland, where we have lots of our history is very much like one big block, which was mostly English oppression for the last 800 years. But this is basically it's just after the expansion to the west. All the towns are new. No, most people here are first generation or have just come from back east. Everything is very sort of unformed, and there's a sort of veneer of normality over it. Everything is a little bit uncertain. Everything is
It's very conditional.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got, sort of as Gar says, a handshake agreement that we're all civilized, but it was cowboy times in living memory and the Civil War in living memory, and then nothing in living memory except for the Wichitas and the Caddos who were there, and in fact the Wichitas weren't super happy to be in Oklahoma either. They got moved in the earlier part of the century, but that stretch of sort of the Great American Desert, as it was called, the internal frontier of America, yeah, it's, as Gar says, it's fascinatingly recent as a phenomenon, and that that blankness underneath it is itself productive of Lovecraftian mystery, as indeed Lovecraft decided when he set 2 stories in Caddo County, Oklahoma. So if you want to bring in the old stuff, the mound is 15 miles south of where our little town is. The Curse of Yig is happening not that much farther away. So you've got old school Lovecraft if you want it, but you've also got, as Gar says, the science horror, the electricity arcing up into the midnight sky and something coming back down, which is so much an experience of being in the American West at night. The notion that you look up and there is nothing between you and Azathoth at all. Van Allen belt is not even in it to win it.
It seems to have 2 contrasting notions of the unknown, where you have some stories where it's like, it is obvious that people have been doing unspeakable things here for centuries, or you never know what's happening behind closed doors, where here it is the unknown of man has not trammeled these lands before. Again, trying to avoid tropes of savages and outsider Indians and so on.
Right.
So as someone who's not a state New Englander, I'm always happy to see, the mythos in my area, my backyard. But what drove you to focus on serpent men and scientific nonsense instead of just traditional mythos for your 3rd campaign?
Yeah, I mean, partly the starting point was okay, where did Lovecraft write stuff other than New England? That where we've got we found that or the Pacific, and that has its own list of issues in terms of just why is my detective in the Pacific? So yeah, we sort of started with the mound and worked from there. Sort of serpent men just sort of crop up naturally. But for each of the monsters and Cthulhu entities, we give a whole list of different variations and possibilities, so you can bring anything out west and have it lurking in the hills.
And certainly, if we're lucky and it gets its own source book the way that Bookhounds did, then we'll be able to really sort of expand on it in the same way that I expanded on Bookhounds and present all the possible dimensions up and down and out from that Oklahoma setting. And I think that's going to be a really good book and a really fun idea to play. And I'm super excited. When Gar suggested it, was like, well, this is obviously Stranger Things. And Gar was like, oh yeah, I guess it is. And so I thought, well, let's have the possibility of having teenage characters, right? Or kid characters that are investigators. And so I wrote up the rules for how to generate those in 1930s Oklahoma and send them out having adventures. A lot of the fiction in that period is about kids doing, getting into trouble, your sort of Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew type stuff. And that's because the fiction was written for young people. It wasn't written for adults. Adults reading children's literature is relatively new. And that is also part of the 30s. And I think it was a fun way, for me at least, to sort of go through something that people do know, Stranger Things, and then back into 30s young adult fiction or kids fiction, and present that kind of a story, which is again something that we haven't seen 8 million other versions of Cthulhu doing. I mean, I did Bubble Gumshoe, which was basically just an excuse to watch Veronica Mars over and over again. But
scholarship.
There hasn't been research, but there hasn't been a kids and Cthulhu type product that sort of foregrounds that as a possibility. And it seems like it's a natural possibility. Plus, Stephen King's It, but instead of horrible New England, it's in newer, perhaps less horrible Oklahoma.
I look forward to the Renegade supplement, Kids on Mind Transfer Machines, for that great race of Yith game with many
Yith kids.
Yeah. Architecture, cyclopean nonlinear angles. With a lot of games, when they have an option of settings, there is usually a fecundity to the options. Were there anything that if you had another 20 pages or whatever, you would have loved to have had? Or is this a question where it's, hey, these are all Kickstarter stretch goals?
Our goal was like have sort of a generic Lovecraftian one, which was the Armored Inquiry, and then do a pulp, clearly pulp, clearly purist one. It wasn't so much like ideas we were dying to do, so much as ideas that precisely fit the brief that we were also trying to do. I mean, the book is already longer than it not quite should be, but it's longer than the first edition. So
in the introduction, I give a lot of examples of narrative structures, and the two new ones that I invented to fill out the list of examples, which I'm not saying I'm in love with, but were the ones that I was thinking about, was the notion where you're a California occult society, like a Theosophists or Rosicrucians or something like that. And you're there and you've got your hilltop and you've got your compound and you've got your robes and you got your weird library. And then the door opens in 1925 and you're like, oh, we didn't make this up. This is happening. That's not good. And because you're conscientious, you're not evil occultists, you're trying to sort of shut the door to outside. In a way, this would be the California version of Fearful Symmetries, which I think is done a lot of what that California one would do, except California would be less William Blake and more William Burroughs. The other one that I put in was just a notion. I was like, a lot of the people in these settings aren't super sympathetic, right? They're mobsters or they're federal agents or they're occultists or they're cowboys who are pretty sympathetic. But I thought, let's do one where altruism is your real goal. And the notion struck me that we've already got London, so why not in the East End of London somewhere, you've got a bunch of people who are out doing charity work and providing care. They might be doctors or priests, or they might be social workers, whatever. And the people in the neighborhoods are saying there's all kind of horrible stuff going on. People in the sewers are eating us, whatever. And the caregivers recognize, oh, they're not making this up. This isn't a hallucination or a superstition. This is really going on. But no one will listen because no one listens to the poor for things like, we don't have any food and our houses are full of rats. So they're definitely not going to listen to a bunch of nonsense. So they find themselves in the position of having to sort of provide shelter to this vulnerable population. And I think that was a fun approach. Again, I don't know if asked to do it, we would do London again. But on the other hand, London's a great location for this kind of stuff. But those are just the ones that I came up with as I'm listing possible narrative structures. But again, I think if you put Gar and I in a room and said, come up with no more than 4 narrative structures, you'd open the door and there'd be 50 of them.
Now I'm looking for the, what would it be? Trail of Jack Parsons' Babylon Working Sex Magic supplement.
Right. Yeah. Well, we already have a scenario on that. The Big Hoodoo, written by the lovely and talented Bill White. I mean, that's in Out of Time or Out of Space, one of those two scenario books.
I think it's Out of Time, but
it's Out of Time.
Thank you, Bryce.
Yes, sir. So to get back to some basic questions about Trail of Cthulhu, the core gumshoe system is pretty straightforward. If you have an investigation ability to get a clue, you get that clue. You can spend point for either opposed or physical actions or for additional information. Does Trail of Cthulhu include any updates to the core gumshoe system? Are there any fun new investigation abilities or changes on the theme there?
No, I mean, you've summarized this in a very elegant way there. No, I mean, the rules, we've done a couple of small tweaks, but the core mechanics are utterly unchanged. The big change is really just presentation, that we've learned a lot in the
16 years.
16 years since Trail came out, and basically a lot of it was basically going, this works well. This idea we had doesn't work well. Like, for example, we've clarified what benefits you get from spending points. Some of the early scenarios were a bit woollier on that. Mechanically, it is still pretty much exactly the same game, just with some very, very minor tweaks. New vested abilities, we've swapped out evidence collection, brought into notice, which is it's more useful. We've tweaked how Cthulhu works a little bit, make it a bit more useful, a bit less of an all or nothing button. We've brought in the magic rules from Rough Magics. We've tweaked a little bit of how the effects of losing too much stability. Yeah, but it is all very, very like touches from the corner. It is very much a revised edition as opposed to a rewrite.
Yeah, we also, I think, the only truly new ability is High Society, which we brought in from Night's Black Agents. That's the, and again, the 30s is a more class-ridden time than our time, even in America, much less in Britain. So it makes sense to have that as a possibility. That means we can deprecate credit rating a little bit, because credit rating was always a thing that sort of didn't quite fit the rule structure. It was half a stat and half an ability pool, and as a result, it didn't really work. And Gar has sort of manfully chopped its underbrush back and made it a more sensible, understandable system. And so, to the extent that anything is really altered, I think that's the biggest one. And it's not that big. I think cop talk has become criminology to sort of encompass, forensics and crime scene looking at and that kind of thing. It's really just tiny little shaves and tweaks, like Outdoorsman is now Outdoor Survival, because that's what it's called in other Gumshoe books, and that seems to be a more sensible name. And I think we melded electrical and mechanical repair, because the number of times in a game that makes a difference to your character is pretty much zero. And it's not like we've got a bunch of, plumbers and electricians and carpenters and joiners and engineers working. You generally have one guy who is the I can fix it guy, and might as well just give him one stat to deal with. So, and again, that was legacy code from Call of Cthulhu. So a lot of what we've been doing is sort of trying to pivot the game a little bit from here's our version of Call of Cthulhu to here is Gumshoe's game of Lovecraftian investigation. And maybe if you're coming to Cthulhu from D&D, not from Call, maybe we would like to welcome you in without having you learn a whole weird different bunch of legacy code that is not immediately relevant to the project of playing the game.
So I no longer have to put points specifically into marquetry versus intarsia for my woodworking character.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. It sounds like it's one of those.
Finally.
It sounds like it's one of those revisions where if it seems like a rule changed, it is probably the case that it might have been poorly explained or someone had kind of the wrong approach to it. And like as a gaming community, over 17 years, just the way we talk about things has probably changed, forcing you to update and adjust to whatever that current thieves' cant of game discussion is.
Yeah, there's a lot of just trying to make sure that what we are presenting is something that a person who started gaming last year instead of in 1981 can parse and move into and play from the jump. I mean, Gumshoe's, as you said, Bryce, it's a super simple system. It fits on one page. The goal is to sort of welcome people into that, as opposed to say, now you have to be able to pick Keith Herber out of a lineup before we're going to let you play this game. I mean, you should be able to know who Keith Herber is, frankly, but that's a question for your morality, not for your gameplay.
Not a barrier to entry.
Right.
One other thing I saw in the Quickstart is the discussion had always occurred in kind of the Gumshoe community, the Gumshoonity, over kind of how to arrange clues to direct play. And one was, I heard described as the Sea of Clues, and another one was kind of the Trail of Clues. Those are terms that I don't believe exist in the 1E of the book that are brought up specifically in the Quickstart. Kind of what are those two theories of mystery craft or storycraft, and kind of what initial advice do you provide to a storyteller or keeper or game master on how to employ those?
It's basically the Ken versus Robin approach. The Trail of Clues is sort of the classic Gumshoe system where basically you've got a series of scenes linked by, normally one core clue in each case. There's a bit of branching, but you have this very, very strong narrative through it. You sort of approach it from a sort of almost like a screenwriting perspective, where you're going, okay, here's the dramatic arc. Here is the most efficient way the players can progress through it. Here are a couple of options, but we want to really focus on laying this trail for them to follow. Whereas the Ocean of Clues is what you get when you do an awful lot of research, and then from this massive pool of clues, you highlighting options and possible ways through. without sort of prioritizing like a sort of quote unquote correct path. Ken, would you agree with that, or?
Really, the reason that it exists is because I refuse to obey any sensible plan. And I like putting all the cool stuff I found out about Vienna in 1948 into an adventure set in Vienna in 1948. That to me is the whole point of playing in Vienna in 1948 is maybe you can wander off and meet Harry Lyman. Wouldn't that be cool? I write adventures that way, and Robin has despaired of ever getting me to write them properly, and so he had to come up with a whole terminology for the way Ken writes it. And the thing about it is that is also, it turns out, really conducive to improv play, that the GM ideally has a bunch of details about their setting in their head, and the players may enter from any different direction, and you have to sort of be able to do that mental billiards and figure out how to bang them around to the other scenes and eventually get them enough momentum that they go into the pocket anyway. And that turns out to be, I think, I don't want to say optimized, but friendly to improv play. And that's how a lot of people play games anyway. And one of the sort of knocks on Gumshoe is that it takes a lot of prep. And it's like, well, it can. Everything can. And certainly if you're playing a proper Robin way, the correct way, yeah, you probably should prep that and know that scenario straight through. But if you're playing the Ken way, hopefully you're so full of wonderful details about Arkham or London or Chicago that you can't just help but run people into trouble and danger when they investigate it. And that falls out the other end. And then Gar has written a bunch of sort of rubber meets the road advice on how to use both methodologies as a GM and as a, to a lesser extent, as a player, right?
Yeah, I mean, none of them are like rule tweaks. It's all about basically how you're approaching your scenario design, how you're approaching running and play, and there's lots of the chapter that expanded the most was the GMing chapter. Crammed all the advice and experience we've had writing and running Trail over the years into that chapter to make it easier and clearer. And yeah, I mean, the improvised nature of Gumshoe plays, I think, one thing we really want to do trumpet in this edition because, as Ken said, Gumshoe's reputation for being this, like, it's a railroad, it's a linear, like you don't roll clues, you get the clues, go to the next scene, which is, I mean, it's not a wholly unfair in the same way you can say, oh, D&D is just combat. That is like, the simplest possible, most unadorned way of playing it, and it's like a very it would be a satisfying experience. You're supposed to like layer on options and intrigue and so forth. But I'm losing my train of thought again. It's 2 a.m. The other thing I wanted to show was like the Gumshoe works really well for improvised play. We have the Armitage Files, which is the greatest campaign of the 21st century, greatest campaign concept of the 21st century anyway. And we wanted to basically build on that and sort of point, look, you can do this too. Because the great thing about Gumshoe is because you can structure the scenes, ensure the players will move forward. In an improvised game, no matter where they go, you can have a clue, point them to the next scene, if that made sense. Which may not
I
have.
feel like every time Henry Armitage goes on scenes in one of my games, one of the characters goes, "Good news, everyone!" As a sign of something truly wonderful is about to happen. It sounds like the Sea of Clues demands both improvisational ability and some pretty high-level command of the setting. Do you feel more geared towards people who already have that expertise in Breton folklore or extensive knowledge of the city of Philadelphia or knowledge of the history of the London sewers or something like that? Or do you think that is a gameplay style that can work to someone who doesn't have that depth of historical knowledge?
Knowing the setting just means knowing what you've decided about the setting, right? You can play a great game in gangster Chicago knowing nothing whatsoever about gangster Chicago except they use Tommy guns and Al Capone is Scarface. And I know that you can because, again, that's how my Call of Cthulhu game ran for 4 years in high school and college. So you just have to know enough about the vibe even to know if they do X, what's likely to happen. Would it have been a richer game if I'd known who Greasy Thumb Music was in 1982? Sure. But I don't think you need to know if you knock over that casino, bad things are going to come after you. If you anger Al, you have to run to another rival mob. And this is all stuff that you've internalized because you've decided. It's not like you were drafted by the government and forced to run a Gangland Chicago campaign. At some point, you said, I'm running a Gangland Chicago campaign. You volunteered. And in my experience, GMs love to know things about their setting, whether it's imaginary or real, whether it's their, the imaginary kingdom of D&D, or whether it's medieval Europe in Ars Magica, or whether it's all the deep lore of vampire. GMs love that stuff and they want to show it off and they want to involve it. And I don't see the point of fighting that tendency when it's very clearly part of the fun for a lot of people. And other people, sure, they're like, I just got off work. I don't want to do any more homework. I want to put them in the front door of the haunted house, and when they come out the back of the haunted house, they need to be dead or insane. That's the job of this game. And the great thing about Gumshoe and the great thing about Trail is that it makes both kinds of play much easier and much more forward moving than they would have been in other game systems. And that's the real great sort of killer app of Gumshoe, and the thing that we've spent 17 years learning how to present, explain, vibe with, and rock with. And that's what Gar has then put back into the GMing advice. At the time that I was writing that GMing advice in 2007, I'd run maybe 5 Gumshoe scenarios. I was in no position to write that. I stole a little bit of what Robin had written in Esoterrorist, but Robin hadn't run that many more Gumshoe scenarios than I had. Now I'm coming up in year 4 of a 6-month Fall of Delta Green campaign. I ran a year and a half of Nice Black Agents. I've run a ton of Gumshoe. Gar has run even more Gumshoe than I have, and so we just the two of us know more about it than anyone did in 2007. And certainly the Gumshoonity, as you say, has got a lot of standard best practices that we would love to incorporate and point out to people who are not yet on the Discord or not yet in the body.
So building off of Terry's question, has the understanding of the period changed since the original book was released?
17 years ago, we still wanted to punch Nazis, trust me. And it's just that the 30s always seemed to me to be a scarier decade than the 20s. If you're setting horror somewhere, put it in a haunted house. And the 30s are a haunted house of a decade. The 20s are a fun house of a decade, which is unsettling in its own way. But the 30s are just god-awful. And the fact that under the wise and benevolent stewardship of our leaders and betters, the world has gotten more like the 30s since 2007, that's just marketing luck, I guess. I don't know that there's been a ton more deep dives into the 1930s. And if there had been, I don't know that it's relevant to play, because you don't need to be going into the documentary history of the rise of the fascist right in France and the role that various perfume and cosmetic manufacturers played in it, to say the Cagulards, and they run around in hoods and they're in league with the Nazis, let's punch them. That's true. And a lot of what makes the 30s accessible in Trail is the same thing that made the 60s accessible in Fall of Delta Green, that the players have an idea of what that's like. They've seen it in movies, or they've, God forbid, read about it in history books, or they have a sense that noir and the Depression and Sam Spade, and they have this knowledge of what that's like. And there's not a lot of point in going and saying, well, interestingly, FDR's approach lengthened and deepened the Great Depression according to modern econometrics. That's not going to help. What's going to help is say, it's the Depression. People will stab each other for a nickel. Go. And then, and there's a nickel. I think that that's really what runs with it. I mean, part of the fun of doing these specific settings that we are doing, these campaign frames, is you get to do that research. And so when I did Bookhounds of London, I got to dig around and learn an awful lot about the book trade in London in the 1930s. But that was sort of providing more possibility for that deeper, richer play going forward. But you could run Bookhounds of London without ever having read any of those books if you just sort of have an imagination about what's it like running a bookshop in the Depression. Similarly, there's been a lot of new research about the Chicago gang wars, some of which I used when putting together the Shadows on Chicago frame, but it doesn't alter in any important respect for the game that I was playing in 1982 with my buddies driving around in our Packards and machine gunning Shoggoths and whatnot.
Also, having done a bunch of stuff set in the modern day, we've done like We did a Lesbian Agents campaign, the Leslie Quartet. The opening scenario is set in Ukraine. That's been slightly overtaken by events. And we did another Lesbian Agents campaign where the evil vampiric plan involves a pandemic. It was also overtaken by events. So I'm very, very glad to be dealing with a historical period which isn't going to change that much in between writing and delivering the manuscript.
Yeah, unless it turns out there was another secret world war that we didn't read about, I think we're good.
But speaking to that period, one of the things that Pelgrane does remarkably well is gives you a sense of place and life. One of my favorite memes that's bouncing around Facebook is the idea of this is what people thought the 80s was, and it shows someone in a bright multicolor leotard with big hair, and this is what the 80s actually was, and it is a brown McDonald's ashtray. What are some of the facts just about the setting of the 30s that you think are helpful for modern players to keep in mind? Like, I remember in the first edition, it's like, by the way, if you want to think of how much something cost back then, just divide by 10 or something. And that's what inflation has been since then. Or just little things like to realize rayon didn't exist yet. What are just some of the little bits that help set place and setting for the 30s before we start adding Shoggoths and Migos and so on?
I mean, first of all, you have to divide by 20 now. The inflation is also not stopped in the last 17 years. The thing that intrigues me when I'm watching movies or reading novels from the 1930s is how much of a role dancing played in your life. Married, single, whatever. You were dancing. And if you weren't dancing, you would be like someone who doesn't play video games now. You were just cut off from a gigantic part of the culture. And not to mention, you could get dates dancing. It was just an overwhelming part of life. And I feel like we certainly have not set enough by weight scenarios in dance halls or anything like that, but it's a whole different universe. If you think about people in middle class Americans, maybe even lower middle class, they had at least one tailored suit, usually a whole closet full of tailored suits if they were middle and upper. Now, everything is off the rack. Even super rich people buy stuff off the rack. You have to be both rich and a clothes horse to go get stuff tailored. If you've got your Karl Lagerfeld or whatever, you're just going to wear it. You're not going to go and have the sleeve taken in by somebody. That's weird. But it was normal because costs were different. Chicken used to be expensive and veal used to be cheap, which is a thing that you just, again, not particularly relevant to a scenario, but a wild thing to think about is that, oh man, we can't afford fried chicken. Guess it's veal piccata again. That's just a wild thing to think of in our universe. It's just different enough that it's exotic, but it's not so different you don't have any sort of kinship or brotherhood. If someone in the 30s is talking about romance and democracy and history and war, they're probably talking about the same thing you're talking about. We're not having to translate like we do for Shakespeare or, for the Aztecs or something. It's a very familiar, and it's just strange enough to be exotic. The 30s, it's like the man says, the past is another country, and this is another country where we still speak the language.
They do things differently there, and apparently with a lot more dancing.
Yeah.
And it answers the question of how do you give it a sense of it being a different place without having to go to some quote unquote exotic locale. Gar, was there anything that jumped out for you as that you kept in the back of your head when you were thinking of the 30s?
I'm much more familiar with like the 30s in Europe and so forth. So a lot of it was basically, educating myself on America and trying to catch up with that. Like I was reading Stephen Zweig's The World of Yesterday, which I picked up going, oh, this is the amusing book that inspired the Grand Budapest Hotel. And it's about like the rise of fascism and this despair at the lost wonders of Vienna, the upheaval and change and the sort of collapse of the old order and this new world trying to be born.
There's an anecdote in David Galerter's The World of the Fair about the 1939 World's Fair, when he says when they were building the fair, they had a shack on the construction site that had dynamite in it. And people were saying, kids might go in that shack. You can't have that shack. That's a bad shack. And so they said, you know what? You've made a good point, Karen. And they put a sign on it that says dynamite, kids stay away. And they hang it on the shack, and that worked. Right? No one stole dynamite from the 1939 World's Fair construction site. It just didn't happen. And if you can imagine modern day Queens with a shack somewhere that says dynamite shack, kids stay away. First of all, it'd be all over Instagram, right? You'd be Insta-ing with your dynamite shack. And second of all, lots of stuff in Queens would blow up. But it also explains, if you're a player character, can I find some dynamite? Well, is there a construction site around? Roll preparedness. It's a different universe in a lot of ways. By and large, a more exciting one. I don't want to say better, because obviously, people were all, sucking on nickels to stay alive, but it's got a bunch of stuff in it that is fun. And again, if that's real, whatever you do at your table to make the game come out right is probably real. They probably did that in the 30s. It's just as messed up as dynamite shack, kids stay away.
And the Empire State Building going up in 14 months.
Right. Yeah, well, that's that hashtag skill issue.
Yeah.
The first edition had a core of mythos creatures. How did you pick what elements of the mythos you wish to include in the second edition? Do you have any favorites? Are there any that you are upset that you didn't have room to include?
I'm always upset when we don't get to include things, because I like including things. For this book, we wanted to sort of, first of all, you have to present the core stuff, your deep ones, your Migo, your Shoggoths, the play the hits, right? Some of the things that I'd done in Ken Writes About Stuff in the Hideous Creatures series, like the Black Winged ones that no one had ever done in any Cthulhu game, we did a pretty great job of that. Gar expanded on them for the Hideous Creatures book. And I thought, well, let's bring them up to the big leagues. But you can't keep bringing stuff up to the big leagues without sending some people back down to the minors. The Loigor have the bad habit of needing a gigantic write-up, because they have a huge number of powers, of being a sub-license from Colin Wilson via Chaosium. And by and large, our goal was to pare down the number of sub-licenses that we needed to keep the core book in print. We're doing it in cooperation with Chaosium. If a sub-license thing is still in there, it's cool. But what we don't want is for there to be a problem when Colin Wilson's estate says $9 is not enough or whatever, and something roils up, or God forbid there's some kind of licensing problem, as we have seen happen to even the most large and well-capitalized of companies. We don't need to go through a waterfall like that. So the goal was to sort of make sure it was all public domain or stuff we made up that can go in. And then once that's the goal, you have some things that are sort of on the bubble. How much Clark Ashton Smith is too much Clark Ashton Smith, things like that. Is this specific Robert E. Howard story in public domain? Fortunately, the Howard Foundation there's a way you can go and you can look at the specific stories and see when their copyright expires when they go into public domain. That was really the main concern, was that was the fence that Kat built around me and said, you can only play inside the fence. And then a lot of the rest of it was just, well, what does that let me do? That lets me add avatars as a class of thing. That lets me do more than one kind of witch familiar, because turns out rat thing, the term, is a Chaosium term, that they own that. Now, we could call something a rat thing all day and all night. The Chaosium guys would be cool with it. But if we call it a rat familiar, then we're belt and suspenders. But once you have a rat familiar, it's like, well, what about a toad familiar? Lovecraft has Saint Toads from Yuggoth, Fungi from Yuggoth poems. Maybe there's a toad familiar, so I get to make up a toad familiar. So a lot of it is just what goes into that structure, given that our goal is to keep the core book as IP bulletproof as we possibly can.
Gar, were there any favorite bits that you got to go in? Were there any bits that you were pleased to see able to make it in? And just kind of like looking over the timeline of it, it's interesting to watch the period as things fall into the public domain, as like The Thing on the Doorstep, The Shadow Out of Time, The Haunter of the Dark.
The good news is Lovecraft has all been in the public domain forever. None of those copyrights were renewed. So
yes, but not everyone was willing to fight it in all cases, from what I understand.
Thank God, so we've never had to fight a lawyer with money.
Actual money.
I will say that when Leslie Klinger, the great annotator who fought the Sherlock Holmes people, all the Doyle estate, all the way to the Supreme Court to make a directed ruling that Sherlock Holmes was in the public domain, when he did the annotated Lovecraft, the farcical Lovecraft estate said, you didn't get our permission. And he said, oh, really? Well, why don't you send me your chain of probate? I'm a lawyer. I will definitely do that. And they said, never mind.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Lovecraft's in the public domain.
Or I guess another way to put it would be like Robert Bloch, R.H. Barlow.
Yeah, Bloch is definitely not in the public domain, right? August Derleth is not in the public domain. which is trouble for people using Byakhis because they're Derliths. The good news is that, as I discovered when writing Hideous Creatures, the Tibetan for bird hound is Byakyi. And what's a better description of the Byakyi than a bird hound, I ask you? So again, there's ways and means of presenting the monsters without stealing other people's trademarks or guarded IDs.
Some stuff I'm looking forward to using. We brought in the mythos data that Ken and Robin invented for their podcast. I would even try and pronounce it, Ken.
Qotha-Nhur'rin.
That's the one.
Yep.
And it's always nice to you have a new bit of weirdness to poke at the players with.
Mm-hmm. Don't make up your own deities. Now I had to write a line that says, all right, we've made up a new deity, but this is why.
The 1E write-up, it contains one of the most inspirational parts to me was the fact that Azathoth is described as monstrous nuclear chaos, or a figure of speech for nuclear power, or the chaos at the core of creation, or the sheer power of mathematics rendering itself conscious due to sheer complexity, or merely a public Nyarlathotep. Why do you think it's important to keep the mythos open like that? It seems like there's a lot of fans that argue over it is specifically this. Why make that choice to keep that space wide as opposed to maybe trying to come up with an internal logic or doing a Derleth and saying, hey, this is how these are all elegantly interwoven?
Something very clear about the fear of the unknown. I mean, you want the mythos to be mysterious, inexplicable, incomprehensible, contradictory, both from a philosophical perspective, because it's supposed to be cosmic horror, it's supposed to be things that man cannot know, but also for players, you want them to be surprised, you want them to be able to use some of the knowledge that they've picked up over the years. If they see a fish things, they can go, oh, it's probably deep ones. But you want it to leave space for them to be surprised, leave space for deep ones to be things other than just fishmen. You want that level of uncertainty and weirdness and also creativity, because it inspires games masters when you offer multiple perspectives and they go, oh yeah, but there's some point between those two. It's really, really evocative to me.
What have we not talked about that the two of you are most excited about?
We haven't talked about the new introductory scenarios. I think those are pretty good. In the first edition, I did my sort of proto Sea of Clues with the Kingsbury Horror, which I maintain, and having recently reread it after Gar upgunned it to second edition, that is a really good scenario, but it is not remotely introductory. I probably owe everyone who ran that as their first ever trail scenario $1. Dollar is metaphorical. But the scenario is not an introductory scenario in any sense of the term. It's an introduction to Ken more than it is an introduction to Trail of Cthulhu, which, great. But we were told, in no uncertain terms, to come with actually introductory scenarios. And so I bagged the pulp one, and Gar got the purist one. And since, as you say, punching Nazis is salient evermore, I said, okay, our pulp scenario is Nazis going after an artifact, and you have to stop them. And then I took a poll of my player group and of the Pelgrane offices and of other people that I knew. And I said, are the Nazis going to Brazil, Iceland, or the Congo? Those are our three possibilities. You pick. And everyone sort of huddled together. And Iceland turned out to be the big winner, which blew my mind. But I said, okay, they're going to Iceland. And then I had to come up with what they were doing going into Iceland. And so the answer is they're looking for the hammer of Thor that is buried in Iceland. Or that's what they think, dun, dun, dun. And I came up with sort of the fun part of the scenario, all the clues, all the research, the home movie of a bunch of guys walking across Iceland in the 1930s that's online. And I did all of that. And I said, well, that looks scenario shaped. And I sent it to Gar and he had to do all the hard part. By the way, I recommend that unreservedly. That is the best way in the world to work, is send it to Gar once it gets too hard. That's called the Hammer of the Gods is the name of that scenario. That's our pulp one. And then Gar, tell us about the cool purist scenario that you event. Gar worked much harder at this than I worked at mine. I will say that. He was just agonizing back and forth. He's like, oh, it's another house. Bah, ta-cha. Yeah. I'm better than this. It's like, Gar, this is how you go to Cleveland and fight the torso killer. Don't be better than this. Regular than this.
It's one thing to do a whole bunch of scenarios, we do anthology scenarios about time travel, or if it's a campaign about the Ryder-Hanrahan, whatever. That's all fine. It was trying to boil it down to here is the first scenario someone will see. Here is the trail equivalent of the haunting. Something that has to be Sort of simple and beautiful, evocative, but also feel fresh and new. So I remember myself and Ken sitting in a bar at Gen Con going, okay, haunted houses, cults, so like, simple things, and then trying to put a twist in them. The scenario Afterlife, the purest one, is your friend calls you, he needs help, and you're basically the aftermath of this seance, and you delve into this like cult that was involved in a small town. I would like sort of take all the sort of classic Cthulhu scenario elements and present them in a way that felt new to experienced keeper or experienced GMs, but was also approachable to new players. And I beat my head off that and wrote it several times, and I hope it's close to right now.
Another thing in the category of Ken comes up with the idea and makes Gar do it is that we talked about the haunted house. We talk about these sort of standard elements, almost building blocks of a Cthulhu scenario. And I said, you know what? Let's just specify those. Let's lay them out. Let's say, what does the ceremony look like? What does the ruin look like? What does this look like? What is this? And again, Gar and I had done a lot of that in Knights Black Agents with the sort of thrilling locations and the scene locations. And so we were sort of used to thinking in those modular terms about spy thrillers. And this was really let's think about this in terms of Cthulhu scenarios. And then I said, and I'm sure you can handle that from now, Gar, and push back. And sure enough, a bunch of them showed up in the document. It's insane. Again, to plug the Gar method, by the Gar method, I mean the Ken method of Gar. Same deal with the Borellus connection, our big globetrotting campaign for Fall of Delta Green, which dropped at Gen Con and is available now wherever fine games are sold, and especially on the Pelgrane website. This was the notion we wanted to do a globetrotting campaign because Delta Green is mostly domestic in the adventures that are out from Arcdream. So we wanted to sort of move that out. Also, you're set in America's imperial heyday, so let's go to our empire and mess around. And the notion was let's follow the heroin trail as our connecting tissue. And who's shipping white powder around well, it's obviously going to be necromancers. So we have our sort of sensation of what's going on. And I wrote the outline of the 8 scenarios, and I picked the fun one, the one set in Saigon. And then I said, and now Gar will do his famous napkin trick and put Gar in charge of doing the other 7 scenarios based, again, on me having done all the fun part, which the research, the making up monsters, all the cool shit. And then Gar has to cobble together things from my outline. I will say that I've played 3 of the scenarios that Gar wrote in my own Fall of Delta Green game. They are bangers, knocked out of the park every time. And then for the 8th scenario, the last one, what came back was my scenario idea as the B plot of this vastly better and cooler scenario idea that Gar constructed entirely out of genius and resentment at me, I assume. Operation Nepenthe, it's the big climax of Borellus Connection. And I think once people start running Borellus Connection, there is going to be a lot of sort of slack-jawed wonder and awe at how insane and great that last scenario is.
As a Philadelphian, the Trail of White Powder just rings true to me. The city that's like Chicago, but it hates you. Borellus Connection is available through the Pelgrane Press Store. We will have a link in the show notes. Bryce knows how to spell Qotha-Nhur'rin. Links to that will also be in the show notes. This goes to Backerkit on October 15th. For people who are interested, what can they do to follow it or get notified of when it actually starts?
Go to the landing page. We have the landing page. There's links in our various ads. There will be a link in the show notes. You go to the landing page. That will take your email and put you on the mailing list to be informed of the campaign when it launches. And you will also get the quick start that you've been alluding to throughout this, the sort of basics, literally the quick start of how to run Trail of Cthulhu, how to play it, plus Gar's brand new other introductory scenario.
It's more of a sketch scenario, but it gives you the whole idea of how it should work.
Is there more in it than Ghost with a Knife? Yes, there is. Therefore,
Yes,
it's an introductory scenario. And also a bunch of pre-gens. So you can start playing Trail of Cthulhu Second Edition right now, or just Trail of Cthulhu, because it'll feel identical to playing Trail of Cthulhu. Then the backer kit launches, like you said, October 15th, should run for a month. And by that time, we will know more about fun stretch goals and add-ons and things like that. I think that Kat is keeping some of those under wraps. Another pair of linked campaign frames, both set in the 1750s and 1760s in England. One is by Phil Masters, and it's about the Lunar Men, who are a bunch of scientists is maybe a strong word, but interested natural philosophers, I think is fair, around Erasmus Darwin and Joseph Priestley and Josiah Wedgwood, who's the guy who paid the bills for the lunar men with his fat porcelain fortune. And they would investigate scientific mysteries. And this is in real life, they would do that. And so the notion is, well, of course, if Erasmus Darwin and Joseph Priestley are involved, they're surely investigating weirder stuff than that. And then Sarah Saltiel, who has written a bunch of really great stuff for the Yellow King role-playing game, contributed a campaign frame in which you're playing in the Bluesky Society, which was the literary and political society around Elizabeth Montagu, and included such and Frances Burney, the novelist, and it included such other leading lights in sort of the men's auxiliary as Edmund Burke and Samuel Johnson, so the poet Thomas More. So it's got a lot going on in terms of intellectual heft. And so you can either play dudes up in the North Country who are meeting terrible, scary auroras, or you can play fancy ladies down in London who are sipping tea and stopping werewolves. And that whole setting era, the 1760s, 70s, is a great era. I think Gar and I have both promised/threatened to do a Hellfire Club book, and if Boundary of Darkness takes off, maybe we can do the Hellfire Club for Boundary of Darkness, which would be great fun. And then that will be one of the add-ons, which I think is not going to be a stretch goal. I think it's just going to be an add-on. It'll be part of the campaign, and other stuff will also be part of the campaign in that wise, but we don't know necessarily what it is. But I believe there will also be a big folio of excluded monsters, because Kat knows the way to keep me quiet is to tell me to go write monsters until I've learned my lesson. We'll have all the ones that were cut out of first edition, and then a bunch of new ones, both new to Trail and new period, that will adorn that fantastic add-on. And that'll probably just be a pure PDF product other than that, but it'll be part of the campaign. And then maybe some other stuff. I'm still trying to get Kat to agree to the expanded Rough Magic, since we've taken the whole point of buying Rough Magics out of Rough Magics and put it in the core book. I feel like that source book, now it's dead and there's still some good stuff in it. So do a revised Rough Magics or an even rougher Magics, or name still under advisement. But we've got a lot of magic systems that I came up with, and Ken writes about stuff that could go into a book. And then you'd have a book of magic systems that could also be played either in straight Trail or as a different sort of an occult adventure game if you didn't want to drag the Lovecraft mythos into it, which many people might not. We will see how desperate Kat is for stretch goals before we get that green lit.
Bryce also included in the show notes Harlem Globetrotters' Mythos Investigators campaign frame When, and I just thought that needed to be brought into the universe.
Well, we know that they teamed up with one set of occult investigators at one point.
Yeah, that van broke down
with
and
the Mystery Machine, the Scooby-Doo people. Obviously, Meadowlark Lemon's taste for the unnatural was only exacerbated by that exposure, and he seeks now for a monster that he can't pull the face off of.
Once there's a community content portal, we'll be there.
Yeah, let you guys get sued. No, they're not the Harlem Globetrotters. They're the Bronzeville baggage carriers. No, that doesn't work either. Damn it.
Gar, Ken, thank you so much for joining. Are there any other projects or things that you want to shout out, or anywhere that you would like to put our audience to know what other projects you have upcoming?
My website is gareth.com. I update it every so often. I'm knee deep in various One Ring things, and coming out hopefully for Dragonmeet will be my venture for Heart, Dagger in the Heart, Road with Deckard, which I'm looking forward to because they do lovely weird stuff.
You've already been nice enough to allude to the podcast. Ken and Robin talk about stuff in which I and my cross-border life partner, Robin Laws, talk about occultism, food, cinema, gaming, more gaming, Elliptony, and anything else that we decide we want to talk about, because that's how we roll. Again, that's at Ken and Robin talk about stuff.com, or it's wherever you find your fine podcasts in the refrigerated section of your grocery. I've also got a Vampire the Masquerade book that's out fairly recently called Blood Sigils. It's about playing blood magicians. So it's actually almost relevant to Mage, frankly. I'm, of course, on Facebook and Twitter as Kenneth Hite, and so I can be followed there with very little cost to you or your sanity. And Arc Dream have hired me to do a annotated Arthur Machen, because the annotated Robert W. Chambers King in Yellow book was so well received, And so I am at some point going to have the free time to do nothing but research Arthur Machen. And that will be whatever 3-month period it is. It'll be the best 3-month period of whatever calendar year it falls in. Because if I got to do nothing else in life but annotate horror classics, I would be a happy boy. This will be the first collection of the entire Little People mythos between two covers. It's going to be focusing on Machen, the writer who made Lovecraft, which is a little unfair to Machen, but whenever you study Machen as a Christian mystic or as a Tory or as a decadent, you're already unfair to Machen. So this is just another, different lens to look at him through, and hopefully a lens that people will be interested in following and then seeing the whole wonder and beauty that is Arthur Machen's writing.
Great God Pan, still a little bit terrifying 130 years later. So,
Yep.
Gar and Ken, thank you so much for joining us this evening here on Mage the Podcast. It has been a true pleasure. A big fan of you both. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Anytime, although next time maybe not at 3:30 in the morning.
Maybe not any time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We'll try for later in the day for you next time. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So, Bryce, we just got to talk to Ken Hite and Gareth Ryder-Hanrahan, who I immediately started calling Gar, which was a little awkward for me. I'm like, is this too familiar? What'd you think?
I don't think it was too familiar. I think it was fine. I think he's okay with it.
That's good. Well, so we are Mage the Podcast. While we are excited for Trail of Cthulhu, we're always looking for how do we jam this into a Mage game. And my first thought about one of the things that comes up in Trail a lot are weird items that have fallen out that are either odd extra-dimensional super science or artifacts from the outer gods or their cults or something like that. And I want to see more wonders that just grant quiet when you got them. It's like, okay, you've got this book in your possession. You have 1 point of outer god quiet, which would be a separate quiet track that would appear like one of the others, but in actuality is kind of a thing unto itself. It is so vast and cosmic that it becomes its own thing. And at 6 dots, instead of becoming a marauder, you kind of fall into them and become one of their agents. I'd like...
Right, you become an avatar or another face of Nyarlathotep or what have you.
You hold one of the many masks of Hastur or become one of the young, as it were, of the Black Goat in the Wood. What was your first thought about, hey, how do we jam this into the Mage?
I was real excited to hear about the Stranger Things style campaign frame, and I think it would be interesting to play something akin to that in Mage. Difficult given that, generally as a young person, you don't have mind or reality warping abilities, mostly due to the fact that your beliefs aren't fully formed yet. But isn't one of the purposes of Mage to have, to more fully form your beliefs and learn what's true and what's real? That seems like a great thing to mix with an adolescent type story.
I like the idea of, yes, you have this group of Aetheryte apprentices that are like, hey, they're doing this cool super science. Obviously, this is human imagination on the brink. And you're like, no, this is actually the inspiration of Azathoth. This equation unto itself, if passed around, will destroy reality. But in the meantime, I have access to matter 3 or correspondence 3 or something like that. So it kind of has this idea of like, maybe we don't want certain things to enter the paradigm. I like the idea that alternatively you have a super scientist that's doing some super scientist stuff. Reality around them is bending, and that has allowed for this Stranger Things style thing, which is then being infiltrated by some cult or dark god. Basically kind of this anti-version of Sanctum. Your chantry has weakened reality enough that weird things start coming through, but not directly, just the idea of things. We're not dealing with Umbrood yet, but mortals are getting strange ideas and gaining access to things that they shouldn't.
Maybe one Umbrood in the first season.
Yeah, one.
It's a big bad monster that eats your foes and friends alike.
Yeah, but to me, like, this screams a chorister or hermetic or Aetheryte or virtual adept game to me. And anyone where their practices are still pretty commonly mirrored by the consensus, or if you have that coven of witches outside town that everyone's like, haha, they're just the weird little old ladies. And that becomes the first little weakening in the wall. Trees start bleeding blood and then suddenly we have servants of Shub-Niggurath coming through.
Yeah, I like it. I like that a lot.
The other thing I liked are the campaign frames. Like, quick starts are fine and everything, but just the fact that they're like, here's 20 townsfolk. You're going to need names, jobs, descriptions, and weird little quirks. Here's 20 of them. And I think that also focuses on the thing I like about in Mage when we're really talking about mages enmeshed into a world with mortals, as opposed to it just being like what I refer to frequently as a Hogwarts game where it's mostly mages doing magical stuff with other magey people.
Right. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that style of game if that's what you want to play. If you want to play a game where you're always in the Umbra, where you can always cast, your vulgar effects because, hey, we write the rules of this reality, ha ha ha.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. That's great. But that's not the kind of mage that I want to play either. Yeah, I want to play the small town mage game where you know the name of the guy who runs the local gas station. And he's not a mage, he's not a vampire, he's not awakened in any way, but he's a little weird. And you don't know why or how, but sometimes when you go there and you get a burrito in the middle of the night, maybe you get a free point of quintessence and you don't know why.
Yeah, and this was something that came up when we were talking about Fearful Symmetries because a lot of the locations were multiply described. Where they're like, this is how you make this gas station friendly. This is how you make it neutral. This is how you make it creepy. And I think there are very much people in the community that just kind of have that engine of ideas that can just come up with people that are a little bit quirky or kooky and places that you just kind of need in your city. And then once you have that in place, you spend that page to say, hey, this is where the meteor landed. Hey, this is where the Umbrood stepped through. Hey, this is where the wonder was discovered. So it's one of those things where it doesn't need to be a jump start or a quick start because you can already have characters, but it can really be an interesting chapter on a game where otherwise you thought you were just passing through. Or it becomes like a 1 or 2 session thing because not everyone's there. And you go, hey, I have this campaign frame of what's a small town outside of where you live?
Weatherford.
Yeah. And you could have the weirdness in Weatherford frame where you're like, well, this is odd. And I think that is something that could be done very well for Mage and exist in this area that isn't an entire campaign, but it does certain things that a quick start maybe wouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might be something that is so small that, like, the technocracy and the traditions don't really care about it that much for the longest time. But hey, now we gotta gather every resource we possibly can because there's a war coming, or there's a storm on the horizon, or what have you. And now suddenly that little weirdness in Weatherford becomes something. Hey, maybe that 1/10 of a point node out there, maybe we do want to pick that up while we still can. If for nothing else, and before the other guys get to it.
One of the things that I get with a feeling of a lot of this is a lot of things are the thin end of the wedge. Like, yes, you can take out one deep one. You can take out one Migo or something like that. But if there's one, there's probably something else that's also running around there.
Right.
And whereas in most of Mage, if you do have a single Bygone or Umbrood or Urban Legend, that's probably the end of it. But just the idea that rather than power necessarily bubbling up from mortal belief, that it comes down from these imponderably potent entities. One of the things I was thinking of is, I don't want to necessarily completely place the cosmology of Mage, but it would be interesting if the Celestines were originally agents of the outer gods. As much as people may not like Derleth, he did give Cosmos' universal war kind of an interesting framing. So for those not familiar, August Derleth aligned the outer gods each with one of the classic Greek elements, and then added another one just so we would have one for fire. I can't remember which outer god he came up with, but I like the idea that their agents became the Celestines, and that there is another horizon that the outer gods are trying to slip through. So that gives a way for these impossibly powerful things to kind of be lurking around the edges. And now we have this weird Dark Forest game where the goal of you as a mage is to prevent the agents of the sleeping Celestines from reporting back home, to remind the Celestines that they are servants of Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Sethagua, whatever your flavor of outer god is. And it becomes this thing where, like, yes, mages are encouraging the potential of humanity, but they can only do so if Uranus doesn't come and gravitationally destroy us.
Right. And sometimes it's nice to have a game where there's a bigger threat on the horizon that kind of puts what you're doing in perspective as not even a microcosm, but irrelevant to what's going on in the bigger picture. And that's really the bread and butter of cosmic horror. It's not that what you do to your fellow man matters or doesn't matter. It's that all of this, in the grand scheme of things, is meaningless because there's a bigger, scarier, worse reality out there. And all it has to do is notice us and be like, oh, hey, there's some schmutz on my collar, and then we're gone. Everything you've ever known is gone.
And I think that's interesting because that would provide almost a second awakening for mages. How do we create, like, yes, I have this paradigm and it allowed me to go beyond the mortal sheeple, but I make contact with the infinite chaos at the core of reality, and you're like, oh, dink. I am just as, and at that point, like, what is the difference between you and a marauder? Mechanically, we know the difference, but like, what happens when you become that character who says there is still something greater? And I think there are ways to deal with it. Like, I think cosmicism, like Nietzsche, is something that I say this tongue in cheek, every young boy should come in contact with and then develop the rudimentary self-defense to overcome it and say, well, that was a fun little thought exercise. I'm going to go on with my life and I'm going to go see a movie now and then have a nice dinner with friends because that will still have meaning after this. It's something that really focuses the mage's mind. I guess in Mage, an equivalent thing could be like, no. I have seen the worm. Or no. I am a non-Nefandus who has peered into the Clipoth. I have divulged into what, like, there are a number of places in Mage that could get us something similar-ish to this, I feel.
Yeah, something kind of close. There's a lot of big bads in the world of darkness. There's the Neverborn, there's the worm, like you said. There's all kinds of the Fomori and from Changeling. The creatures that may have influenced whatever consciousness's dreams were there before humanity learned how to dream of a better future. There's always something especially in the world of darkness, that's trying to drag us back down or drag us down to begin with. So this fits in perfectly with Mage and the greater world of darkness cosmology, as it were.
I also like the idea that one of the things that I don't think we've really talked about is one of the technologies within Trail of Cthulhu is if your character dies, there was someone who they were keeping in contact with, an academic interlocutor, a cousin, a spouse, an old friend, somebody at the Journal of American Progress or something like that, who, if your character dies, within a little bit, they're going to come and poke around. I kind of want, like, more lethal mage games like that, where you're investigating something, maybe it's tied to the disappearance of your mentor, and you start going on this like Masks of Nyarlathotep game. Not quite as extreme, but something that's a little bit more lethal than we're used to dealing with in a World of Darkness game. But if your character dies, someone else from their chantry comes in, or someone else that was servant to the same mentor comes in. And now we very much have character death on the table repeatedly in a way we don't often have in World of Darkness. I'm not going to quite go, you're a technocratic iterator, and we're going to do like the DCC funnel where the first dungeon we get 40 little technocrats and the 5 that survive. Guess what? Those are your characters.
Oh, when you said that, my mind immediately went to paranoia. All right, well, your character dies and here's your clone gets decanted from the vat and he gets all your notes. You're now playing, Terry Robinson -2. Go.
I mean, that would be certainly interesting, where it was like technocracy takes on the outer darkness, where it's like, well, we have all these hit marks, we have all these victors, we have all these black suits. Let's see what happens. And
you get throw them all out there. Yeah. See who comes back.
And you got 5 goes before your clone is no longer sufficiently coherent to stay together or something like that. I also like the idea of tying each one of the Umbrae plus the digital web kind of to an outer god. And that is the way that you would approach exploring them. Like the idea that Azathoth is the result of data and mathematics being sufficiently dense at the core of creation to create a rudimentary cosmos. That just sounds like the digital web to me. Yog-Sothoth being the embodiment of all space-time and being all-knowing and being transcendent. That feels high umbral. Shub-Niggurath, the Black Goat of the Woods, feels middle umbral-y with primal emotion.
So it sounds like you're just replacing existing ideas with a darker, more sinister thing. Because as we all know, the digital web is Mount Koth or Calf. I'm never sure how to pronounce that. I've always pronounced it Quoth, but there's no U. Anyway, it is Mount Quoth, which is the correspondence point where all things come together. So yes, because Azathoth is the center of all reality through which, all things join in, cosmic terror. Yeah, absolutely. That's that. And because the Middle Umbra is the realm of Gaia and the other spirits of nature, yeah, the Shub-Niggurath is a dark version of that. So I do like this, but it seems like it'd be a much darker world if that were the case, which is fine, which is fun.
It would, yeah. To me, what this does is maybe instead of disembodiment, if you spend too much time in these places, something an awful lot like these entities start reaching out to you. Low Umbra for me was Nyarlathotep, a chaotic trickster messenger of the other gods, embodying madness, deceit, dark aspects.
And he's got the undying pharaoh aspect to him, which kind of works for the underworld. Yeah, I like it, but I would recommend rather than having just, like the Hounds of Tyndalos come and get you if you're in the High Umbra for too long, you do start to disembody, but instead of just becoming, you're not Terry the mage anymore, you're Terry the spirit that was once a mage. Now you're becoming more of a spirit of Nyarlathotep or a spirit of a servitor of Shub-Niggurath.
And it doesn't need to be specifically those entities, just the idea that what if each Umbre were literally, we get the idea that the digital web is semi-conscious. What if all of them are? And maybe there's a war between a positive and a negative aspect of it that's been shifting over time, and that's what makes it the world of darkness. Or these are the embodiments in the same way that in Exalted, Malpheus is made out of Malpheus. What if the pure ones kind of subdued these entities to create reality, and that we're just kind of living inside of them?
Yeah, I was thinking of how in, I think it's Norse mythology, Odin chopped his dad up and made the world out of Ymir's bones or what have you.
Yeah.
And I'm probably getting the names wrong there. I don't think it's Ymir, but...
Ymir, slayed by Odin. Yep.
Hey, Ymir, I was right.
Vili and Ve. His flesh became earth, his blood formed the oceans, his bones became mountains and rocks.
And his brains became the clouds.
His eyebrows formed Midgard. Yep. And I think that could be a primal thing. And maybe that's something that the bad guys in your setting are trying to do. That there are these new phenomena that occur in each of the Umbrae, and that is those gods gaining dim awareness of who they are again. And now your characters have to go through reality and destroy all H.P. Lovecraft stuff to prevent that psychic energy from rousing them. You want that shit to get meta real fast.
Absolutely.
And the other thing to me is one of the things that we never really got in Mage were the Aeons / the Uthras. They're referred to as the high umbral Celestines. In that the Celestines are generally from the Middle Umbra, planets, so on and so forth, that we get the high umbral versions that may reflect anger. And I think this is also a case where weird, massive, not necessarily malevolent Cthulhuoid entities could come out. Yes, I understand that if you say that they're not malevolent, they're no longer Cthulhuoid. But like one of the ones I had was Eoquoth, the Dreamweaver of Intimacy, whose domain is mundane experience and everyday life. Whisper into the hearts of mortals to turn everyday joys and intimacies into orgiastic occasions, or alternatively causes of obsession, jealousy, and paranoia that may have a dark reflection that indicates codependency and toxic relationships and the desire to manipulate others. But just like, let's have more big, weird spirit things out there that aren't just like, I am the spirit of love.
Well, I mean, you got to be careful because if you go too far in that direction, you get Brian Lumley. Nobody likes Brian Lumley's mythos stories. The
Who
Titus
is that?
Crow series. Brian Lumley, I think he's a British author. He wrote a series about a character called Titus Crow. What else has he written? He's written something that's much more famous than that.
Necroscope.
Yeah. He wrote, I think it's a series of 3 books about a character called Titus Crow who travels around the multiverse in a large hollow clock, and he has human companion. It's a Doctor Who pastiche.
It's a little on the nose, yeah.
And he has benevolent Cthulhu entities in that, including Cthulhu's twin brother, who looks exactly like Cthulhu.
Ulahat.
He has kind blue eyes.
Just,
So that keeps you from going insane if you look at him. Yeah, it's like I said, it's definitely a series of books that was written.
Noted. But yeah, not necessarily nice, but less actively malevolent. Where it's like, nope, I'm just doing my thing. Sometimes dreams get you through a hard work day, and other times they drive you to madness. I think I just want more of those kind of weird entities. And to me, the thing I like about it is the hierarchy of it, where you have an outer god, an elder god, a servant, a servitor, a mortal cult, and whatever they're doing. And everything kind of feeds up to the next higher layer. And that's something I would like to see. We kind of get the idea of those broods, but we never get like the mundane reality side of that. Like, yes, you can have a problem with Stag, and Stag may report back to the Brood of Heart or something like that, but they're never spending enough time on this side of reality for it to be really a problem. And I would love for some chain of being to stretch across the gauntlet in such a way that where it's like, oh, Nelly, you've tinkered with something you shouldn't have.
I mean, if you tick off cockroach enough, your house gets infested. So that's one counterexample. But yeah, I see what you're saying. It's the spirits or the spirit broods or what have you. They're a bit far removed, and if you go into the middle or high umbra and you upset the court of the winds, oh no, the zephyrs are mad at you, and now it's always windy wherever you go. Oh no. I mean, that doesn't sound so bad until you realize that that's tornadoes and hurricanes coming to your house every day. That's not great.
To me, the hard part is working its way up and down. Like, I don't get the sense in Werewolf that if you are an exterminator, that cockroach delivers doom upon your house. You seem to have to anger cockroach at a more spiritual, higher level. Like,
right.
Cockroach has to know about you as an entity, but just the fact that, like, again, your Hounds of Tindalos example or something, there's a Hound Master, and that can make its way up to the many-angled ones, or those from Broken Space, or a Creature of Antitime, or something like that. So I more like the idea that you pull on a string and something higher and higher keeps unraveling. And I think a lot of these are also good options to have weirder paradox entities. I do like the idea that if you mess around with mind too much, maybe too much astral projection, something goes wrong with time, boom, great race of Yith thinks you're real interesting. And suddenly your body's left in some sort of time cylinder for a little bit while you cool your jets or something like that.
I know they just sent someone to replace you while you go back in time and write down everything that you know for decades of subjective time.
Yeah. And then they project you forward and you see the coleopterans or whatever, and you're like, well, that's lame.
Why am I even bothering to pay my bills?
Exactly.
We're all replaced by giant Spider-Men. Ugh, who cares?
Who is the conqueror that takes over Earth for several thousand years?
That's Kang. Kang the Conqueror.
Kang the Conqueror, yes. The noted Marvel Cthulhu crossover, yeah. Which there have been in a number of cases. So those were kind of like my initial ideas that fell out of revisiting Trail of Cthulhu. The other thing I wish Mage would take is take one edition, take a whole bunch of play feedback, and just explain the edition better. We used to kind of do that, but in M20, Book of Secrets came out right after the core. Like, there's no way that it reflected 10 years or 5 years of people playing on it. So I think it would be fun for the community to come together and do something like that. And kind of the next project I want to do is the Book of Lacunae, which is like the little holes in the game where you're like, I don't know what to do here as a storyteller, or like, let's try and explain this to you 2 or 3 different ways that all get to the same point. But that's kind of a meta consideration.
Yeah, it would be an entirely different world if they had, consistent line developers who went from, revision to revision, taking notes from feedback instead of, not to denigrate anybody's efforts, instead of having the great man theory of Mage history, where whoever the current dev is like, no, this is what we'll do. This will show them. Everybody will be on board with this. And then 3 books later, we have a new line developer like, okay, all that was hot garbage. Here's what we're going to do. It was hubris for them to think that they could bring everybody together. I won't be like that. I'm better than that. Perhaps better than the gods.
What campaign frames would you like to see for Mage. The one that keeps occupying more and more space in my head is the Jack Parsons Sex Magic Babylon working angle. I also want to see your Harlem Globetrotters one. Let's not let that one wither on the vine.
I mean, that I said that one as a joke when he mentioned globetrotting. That's the first thing that came to my mind. But yeah, actually, a group of Akashics or other physically oriented mages who, whose paradigm is competition or teamwork or some combination thereof, coming together because teamwork, that's their thing, to go around solving problems of all sizes, small and, reality shattering. That sounds really fun to me.
Yeah, rather than having the cover of a traveling circus, we have a charismatic faith healer or a group of combat dance art people. And yeah, you solve the mystery in your town when you're there. And here are the other weird people associated with your group. Kind of like Midnight Circus, but not evil.
Yeah, like the original Midnight Circus before it went bad.
That's the strangest origin story where it's like, it was the union of these two Roman cultures. You're like, wait, what?
It's super fun, though. It's one of my favorite non-game line branded World of Darkness books, which is kind of, it's better, much better than World of Darkness racial slur. That's what I'm trying to say, guys.
You're allowed to say the word combat, Bryce. Jeez.
Sir, World of Darkness Combat gave us the best iteration of the World of Darkness system. Street Fighter, the RPG.
That was the other way around. Street Fighter gave us World of Darkness Combat.
Did it? I thought Street Fighter came out of that. Oh, okay. Dang, I've been thinking it wrong for 20 years.
It did give us maneuver cards. My favorite thing in that book was the Mage section, which I was reading through, and it's like, here's a cool way to use auspics to pilot a nuclear weapon into a wraith or something. And then you get to the Mage section.
That'll never come up.
Yeah. And then foreshadowing. And then you get to the Mage section, and it's like, Mage is too varied for us to say anything. And I'm like, what? That's it? Like, I'm still angry at that book.
Didn't it have rules for dough in that book?
It had maneuvers, which almost never made sense. Where it's like, spend 2 turns and you do this thing that does 1 point more damage. I'm like, how about I just shoot him twice in a row?
That sounds no. That's ridiculous. Why would you want to use a gun to kill someone who's trying to kill you? That's
10 sphere, not even once. So, any other thoughts on Trail of Cthulhu?
I enjoy the game. I'm probably going to pick up the second edition. I'm probably going to back it on Backerkit, not Kickstarter.
Yep. Somewhere Ken Hite gave his Calvinist smile to you.
It's the highlight of my evening. I really want to see some of the new whatchamacallits that they've added. Occupations. I like to see some of the new occupations that they've added. I hear that they've added cowboy.
Yes.
Sounds very interesting, especially given that the Oklahoma setting, where presumably that will be heavily featured, is not the pulp setting. So it's a more down-to-earth, realistic cowboy investigating Cthulhu mysteries. I mean, hey, it worked for Dracula. So
yeah. And then there was Down Darker Trails, which I haven't seen before. That was Chris Spivey's take on it. Where it's like, no, we will give you 30 pages on period appropriate guns that are all systematically identical. And you're like, yes.
I have Deadlands for that.
Yeah. Go back it if you want. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell us. If you didn't enjoy this episode, that's okay too. What are we going to do next? Bookhounds?
God, I hope so. I love that campaign frame. So very incredibly niche, but it seems super fun.
Let's do Book Wars. Okay, Bryce.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
All right, man. Have a good night.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where when we stare into the void and the void stares back, we're just flattered for the attention. The show has been made possible by our executive producers, starting with the oracles of the following lesser-known outer gods. Ben Bendelow, Oracle of Zignaroth, the Whisperer of Forgotten Passwords, God of Memory, and the Eternal Struggle with Lost Password Credentials. Buck Gargary, Oracle of Blorgoth, the Devourer of Remote Controls, God of Consumption and Hiding Essential Things in Plain Sight. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Yignoloth, the Eternal Drip, God of Cosmic Rain and Leaky Faucets that keep you awake. Guy Stewart, Oracle of Clorclath, the Great Keeper of Misplaced Socks, God of Entropy and Vanishing Laundry. Mikhail, Oracle of Ixtul, the Harbinger of Wi-Fi Outages, God of Chaos and Endless Buffering Cycles. Pukaji, Oracle of Malaltholoth, the Shatterer of Quiet Spaces, God of Silence and Sudden Unstoppable Sneezes during important meetings. Sean Gallagher, Oracle of Ichlor, the god of awkward small talk, god of conversation and excruciatingly forced elevator discussions. The crew of Erebus, Oracle of Ichlor, the binder of stale snacks, god of time and that bag of chips that is always slightly staler than you want it to be. Jason Vines, Oracle of Ublor, the scribe of illegible notes, god of knowledge and the eternal misinterpretation of your own handwriting. Derek Semsek, Oracle of Tilzath, the manipulator of forgotten birthdays, god of time and unfortunate realizations at 11:59 p.m. Drawn Cap, Oracle of Drugtoth, the master of grocery lists left at home, god of foresight and the groceries that you always seem to forget, along with Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Alex, Alexia, Ambia Andrews S., Anon, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubble the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sig, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David McFall, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fraggerock, George Laura, Gray Trillick H, Ia Bolt, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Lulz and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Menel Canos, Matthew Prohl, Maurice Hopkins, Melissa Krause, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Pax Cow, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Candy, Samuel Tobin, Sev Nessus, Simon Strand, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, That's Real Neato, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, William Conley, William Martin, Will Vincent, and Wolf Larryson. Our EP shoutout in this episode is to Simon Strand. I had a lot of options to work with for both Simon and Strand, so I decided to go with DNA facts. First, your DNA could stretch to the sun and back. An individual strand of DNA from a single cell goes about 2 meters long, but if you combine all of it from the cells in the human body, it reaches to the sun and back over 600 times. We share about 60% of our genes with bananas. That's because we all kind of have a shared ancestry. Some basic cellular functions are encoded in identical ways. About 8% of our genome is made up of viral DNA, remnants of ancient viruses that infected our ancestors and inserted the genetic material into our genome. Endogenous retroviruses, that's one heck of a ride or die. Identical twins don't have identical DNA. While identical twins are nearly identical genetically, they accumulate small differences and mutations as they age, resulting in subtle variations. The human body has more microbial cells than human cells, somewhere between about at parity and 10 to 1 depending on who you ask. In fact, the microbiome in your gut is about 150 times as many individual genes as the human genome. Also, the DNA is repairing itself constantly. In an average day, cells in your body receive tens of thousands of DNA damaging events from environmental stressors, but DNA has self-repair mechanisms that fix most of these things. When I think of epigenetics, the origin of evolution, the ability to predict complex traits, and single nucleotide polymorphisms, Simon, I will think of you. If you'd rather listen on YouTube, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a hop and Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.